The profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely encountered even in 100 million kalpas. Having it to hear, accept, and maintain, may I taste the truth of the Tathagata's words.
Good morning. We have a guest speaker today whom I would like to introduce, Caitriona Reed. We've been friends for about 25 years, although we don't see each other very often anymore. So Caitriona started as a Vipassana teacher in the early 80s. And then in the early 90s or 80s, studied with Thich Nhat Hanh and was empowered also as a teacher in Vietnamese Zen tradition. So she has these two main threads. And then she's taken up a serious interest in indigenous spiritual traditions and has woven that in. And she's a social activist. And back in the day, she transitioned to becoming a woman, and maybe the very first trans Dharma teacher, or at least the first out Dharma Dharma teacher we have. So what else shall I say? She lives in Warner Springs with her partner, Michelle Benjamin Miki, and has a retreat center there. That's just outside the Anza Borrego Desert. And I visited her there when I went to Anza Borrego one time. Otherwise, we've mostly met at Zen conferences, and we don't attend so much anymore. So we've started Zooming instead. I think that's about enough just to say, here's Caitriona with a very interesting voice, and I welcome you to Stone Creek, Caitriona.
Thank you so much. I'm honored and delighted and happy to see you all on this Sunday morning. Maybe I will begin as I would begin here on this land, surrounded as we are by tens of thousands of acres of wild land, and honor and request the permission of the ancestors of this land to speak the truth in as best way as I can, and to honor also for all of us, I speak for all of us, the ancestors of our blood and our Dharma, all our teachers, lineage, the ancestors of our spirit. And Jisho, you'd asked me to speak a little bit about my story, which I will, but perhaps first I'll begin just by saying a few things that have been on my mind, and then come to the story through that. So as you said in your introduction, in your kind introduction, I do have some interest in indigenous practice, and I've been working with a number of teachers both in the North and the South. But that goes back a long time. Somewhere in my teens, I read an essay of Gary Snyder's in which he spoke of how the Buddha may in some ways have been seeking to reawaken our collective roots in our collective Paleolithic past. And if you look at the way the Vinaya, the ethical code, the monastic code was set up, if you look at the way he broke down the very rigid, even then in India, the very rigid constraints of caste and gender, including untouchables, including women in the community, how he created the community as a very horizontal system. The first council took place very shortly after his death, how all of that harks back in a way quite different from what was the norm in Indian culture, harks back to an indigenous, or we could say a Paleolithic past. And that kindled my interest. And Gary Snyder also was probably one of my first impulses toward an interest in the practice of the Dharma. So what's on my mind in light of this interplay between our time now as modern day Buddhist Dharma practitioners and our indigenous past is how much we've been appropriated by what passes for the dominant culture. And of course, what's on my mind more than anything, as with all of you, no doubt, is the nature, the political, environmental, social nature of our times, how it's bringing us together and it's separating us. It's bringing us together because here I am talking to you, which I might not have been had we not had the COVID, had we not had the emergency of these times. And I think of how the education system, the mythologies of scientism, which isn't to diminish the science mythology, method, scientific method, but there's a kind of fundamentalism that has infected our medical system, the way we're educated, and also the political sphere. And we have this insistence on being right, this inability to really converse. I drove past a Trump rally in Temecula yesterday. 50 or 60 very enthusiastic Trump supporters suggesting we honk if we supported them. And I couldn't resist rolling down my window and in a very loud voice shouting no. And it got them very excited. And it was a moment that I quite enjoyed. And I think my fantasy was to stop and approach on foot and say, you know, we probably agree on so many things. Let's have a conversation about what we really want, what we're really afraid of. Of course, it's a fantasy I didn't know about manufactured truth, even when we're at our best. It's the story of a king, a very enlightened king who I was speaking to a spiritual advisor one day and said, you know, it would be so good if everybody really committed to telling the truth. And I think I'm quite harsh, you know. He said, I think I'll make it a capital offense if anyone tells a mistruth. And his spiritual advisor said, well, good luck with that. And the next day when the spiritual advisor came to visit the palace, the guards who'd already been instructed asked, where are you going? And he said, I'm going to be executed. And he said, the guard said, well, that's not true. Well, you better execute me then. But then that would be the truth. Ah, your truth. So it's not an easy story. And it's not an easy thing that we have negotiating the truth that helps us feel safe. The truth that helps us feel we're on the right course when perhaps we're not, but we only realize later that that was the case. Or when we think that we're practicing an authentic Dharma and we only find out later, as is natural, that perhaps it wasn't as authentic as it might have become, as it does become. And that's why I've loved the Dharma for so many years, that it has its own self-destruct mechanism built in. It undermines itself. When I first met Thich Nhat Hanh at a interfaith conference, I had in my mind at the time, I said to him, I'm thinking I want to graduate from the Dharma. And he kind of liked that idea. And we talked about it on and off through the conference, this sense of moving on beyond what we imagine is our identity or imagine is our foundation. And I suppose now I'm thinking of a comment that William James made. He said, truth is what is useful. And I was thinking about that yesterday and thinking that untruth also is useful to us, but it's only useful for us as a fence, as a way to prevent ourselves from going deeper into a more profound authenticity, a more profound connection to what is real. And I suppose the part of that was my impulse to transition. I was teaching in the 90s and talking a lot about coming into an authenticity that went beyond the forms of our practice, that went beyond the forms of what we were studying in Buddhist teaching, in Buddhist psychology, and to really look at the desires that drove each one of us. And I could hardly do that sitting on my cushion with this very strong impulse, this very strong dysphoria, if you will, around my own gender identity. So I transitioned somewhat on the job, and people for the most part were very kind and very supportive. I was fortunate. And even Thich Nhat Hanh was very, very generous. And it became very quickly a secondary element to my life. Not that there aren't challenges. It's not anything I'd recommend to anybody to change your sex. But it's like a divorce or a change in career. It's something that preoccupies you for a time. And then you move on, hopefully having learned, having integrated something, having undermined perhaps a sense of what we perceive as unreal or real. I think it also teaches you humility, because in invalidating my status as a white male, I certainly became second class, certainly became humbled by the realization that certain things I'd taken for granted no longer applied. And I think practice is good for that too. The humbling of not knowing anything. And so my path led me to leave. Until recently, Michelle and I have both come back to teaching in a more formal way on Zoom for the most part. But for a number of years to really continue to explore this question of what is real, what is true, what is authentic, through upping our practice as coaches, as trainers in hypnotherapy and neurolinguistics, as facilitators of family systems, constellation work. And then more recently and quite intensively in the last few years, working with Indigenous teachers and Indigenous plant medicines, which if any of you know, can kick your butt. I'm talking about principally ayahuasca, which I find to be very compatible with Dharma practice. In fact, some Zen friends of ours have sat with us recently, and I was very excited to see both how they would experience the medicine and also how the medicine would experience them. And it was quite favorable. The practice really does help us create a foundation of humility and strength. And I realized in my early ceremonies how little I actually knew. So that's what I've been teaching all these years. Now I'm beginning to understand. Things really are interconnected. And I wanted to touch on, I'm looking at the time, I'm going to talk for maybe less than 30 minutes and then open to more of a discussion, as that's often more, at least if not more, fruitful, because I don't really know any of you except for Jisho. But I'm thinking of the Diamond Sutra and how close it is in its underlying message to a very, for want of a better word, indigenous worldview. And it's very essential to our Dharma practice. Maybe you've studied it, maybe you know it. And the first premise, of course, is to question the distinction we make between the human and the non-human, or more particularly between ourself and the not-self. And of course, we're wired for our own survival as infants and into our adulthood to create a subject-object relationship, to protect ourselves, to allow ourselves to feel safe. But it's a ruse, it's a convenience. And once we go a little deeper, we see I won't say the falsehood, because it's not false, it's true, that distinction between subject and object, between me and another, and yet it creates such a barrier. And the Diamond Sutra begins by questioning that. The foundation of the Dharma begins by questioning that arbitrary distinction we make, but it goes further. And it invites us to question the distinction between the human and the non-human beings. I was on a call with David Loy the other day. Some of you may know him or know of him. And it was about, of course, the application of the Dharma to environmental responsibility. And someone was speaking of how in their work, and they were full-time environmental activists, people even there made this distinction between human well-being and the well-being of other beings, as if the impulse towards a vital environmental movement was really to allow us to feel safe, to allow us to continue our, I want to say our wretched lifestyle, our privileged lifestyle, privileged by the standards of all the environments and creatures whose lives we're decimating. And I think many of us, even if we live in a fairly rural environment, live so apart from living beings. Michelle and I are fortunate in that we live in wild land. We have daily encounters with surprising creatures, some of them quite large and challenging, like mountain lions, and some quite delicious, and some quite, I don't mean we eat them, but delicious as beings. And we've taken on a practice from the Tzotzil Mayans of the highlands in Guatemala, and we address them often quite out loud as Your Majesty. We see a rabbit as we step outside in the morning and pause for a moment, create an open space in the heart, and Your Majesty. Or a hummingbird on its way to Central America at our feeder. Or even a dung beetle slowly moving across the path. Your Majesty. Why not? It certainly helps, in our experience, helps us embody some part of the Diamond Sutra, not to make that distinction, to recognize the majesty of that being, of that being's world. The next distinction is to, as laid out in the Diamond Sutra, is the distinction we make between living beings and non-living beings. Thich Nhat Hanh used to talk about after Hiroshima, when they were rebuilding the city, they removed ceremonially removed, for some reason I'm drunk with my words today. They ceremonially removed some of the rocks in the ornamental gardens and took them out to the countryside and had a service for them, a burial service, and brought in new rocks, uncontaminated by the devastation, and created new gardens. They didn't just clean off the old, they created a whole new environment. Not making that mistake that just because they were rocks, they didn't have an essence, a being. And we say, when someone asks us, so what is Buddhism? We say, well, it's simple, everything's alive. Everything matters. Everything's conscious. And then the fourth distinction that's laid out in the Diamond Sutra is around the distinction we make between living beings and death, or life and death. I think it was Alfred Whitehead who, in some memorable quotation, said that, and we know it from our practice, all time is present in the now, all past, all future time is here and now with us. And of course, we make that distinction. There are those we loved who have gone. There are those not yet born who we imagine not to be present, generations to come. And yet, if we inform ourselves with a recognition that our healing, our work, our coming into fullness, our coming into the vitality of our life is a healing for the ancestors who we haven't probably grieved in full. And it's a healing also for the benefit of those yet to come. You know, as I say these things, I suspect, given my audience, that you all sort of know this already, and yet I don't think it hurts to reiterate. So I'm not sure I wrote to Jisho this morning and said I probably have about 4 Dharma talks. Well, I just gave them in a condensed form. And if there are questions about any of the things I mentioned, I think I'm quite happy to open to a discussion, even though I've been speaking for only 20 minutes. Does anyone have any thoughts? Do you relate to any of what I'm saying? Any questions? Feel free. I don't know how the format goes. If you raise your hand, someone will unmute you. Or maybe you unmute yourself and speak up. How does it work?
We ask each person who wants to ask a question to unmute themselves and speak up. So my dears.
Okay.
Thank you for your talk.
You're very welcome.
What I was struck by is when you say perhaps we should go beyond Dharma. And I am not sure what you mean by that, but because Dharma to me means life and life teaching. So is it that we don't use the language because language is not important, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, good. Thank you. You're clearly more far along the path than I was. In a breaks 20 years ago, I was really harboring that the Buddha Dharma, that lots of things were great. You know, I was very ecumenical. I loved Islam and Christianity. I have some Jewish roots, so I have some affection for that. But I realized I was harboring a notion that some of the tenets of the Buddha Dharma somehow trumped the rest. The Buddhist take on impermanence, for example, something that everybody is aware of to some degree, was somehow more complete than a non-Buddhist, non-Buddha Dharma take. So I think we have to be, perhaps I should correct what I say, that we have to challenge ourselves to go beyond what we assume is our truth. Our truth is what is useful now, not necessarily what will be useful in the future. So knowing knowing Jisho, I kind of trust that she's teaching you well to do that. But I'm also very aware how in this era of polarization and strong guarding our affiliations, I'm aware how strong the tendency is to polarize, to create difference. I think perhaps it's also a human tendency. And I agree with you that the Dharma by implication is all inclusive, but then so is Christianity, and look what happened to that, and so on. So I hope that makes sense. For a long time, I was rejecting the Buddha Dharma because of what it arrived like a thundering insight. It was like a moment of liberation when I thought, my God, I've been doing this for so long. I've been favoring the Buddha Dharma. And there's so much I've been missing in doing that. And it's not something we tend to do. I think we all tend to do, because I study many things. I'm a tarot reader, for example. So I look for correlations between tarot cards and elements of the Dharma or elements of medieval mythology. And you may study Gestalt therapy, and then you look at psychoanalysis, and then you starting to make maps across to look for correspondences to make the system more comfortable for you. And I think partly what I'm implying is this opportunity we have when we encounter something new, a system or a little bit of information from outside or from within ourselves, to resist the temptation to slot it into a convenient box. This is what this means. To be, my encouragement is to be more naked, if you will, than any of us are really, especially to go back to my original point about the appropriation that we've encountered in our minds and spirits through the dominant culture. especially in the light of how we're victims, all of us, of the logical, mechanical worldview that science has given us. So does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. I
Yeah.
think it talks about, let's say, being vigilant about not being, having a tunnel vision, because we practice Buddhism, so we know the truth, and
Exactly.
we question that constantly.
Yeah.
Constantly. Okay. Thank
You know,
so much.
there's a story in the Avatamsaka Sutra. The story, as you may or may not know, is the only in the classical Mahayana, or any sutras really, it's the only sutra that is the story of a hero quest, of an adventure. And it's the story of Sudana looking for the future Buddha. And he goes to different places. And one part of the story that really strikes me is how he came upon some hungry ghosts. And even they could teach him, because they said, really, if you want something, really, really want something, maybe you should bow a lot. Maybe you should do prostrations more. Maybe you should really focus your desire towards getting what you want. And so even there, Sudana learned from ghosts you'd never imagine you could learn anything from. And I think in this time, again, going back to the little Trump rally on the corner of the street in Temecula, I know there's something to learn there. If only to melt my own heart toward the fear and horror I have of what's happening in our democracy. Even with this notion that we have of democracy, another mythology that we, in this country particularly, kind of don't question. It's a system that has worked to some degree, but like other systems, has failed very badly in other ways. So yeah, all of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, just go ahead and unmute, and if you want to speak.
Yes, this is something I've been wondering about, well, for as long as I've been practicing, and I'm not sure if this is appropriate at this moment, but it goes back to impermanence. You know, I had a friend of mine who died of cancer. His name was Brian. And since then, and well, for as long as I can remember, I've been wondering, you know, where, you know, what happened to Brian? I mean, where is Brian and where is he now? I mean, where did he go after he died? I mean, I've always wondered about that, and I don't even know if there's an answer, but I wanted to know what the Buddhist approach is to where people go after they die.
Well, I can't, or I won't speak for Buddhism, but Brian clearly is here now in our conversation. And the degree to which you honor and love him, that's here now, came up within you, and I can catch a little bit of it. And I'm sorry for your loss. The Buddha adopted significantly, or partially, the view of his time around rebirth, which I think is a somewhat simplistic and mechanistic view of things, because what if there's no birth and no death? I prefer that. And certainly in my experience, I got much closer to my father after he died. I think of him often. Last night I dreamed of him, and he was as present as could be. And if rebirth is a real model, then maybe we get reborn into the past as much as into the future in multiple forms. I don't know. You know, any truth that would explain that would be a truth to explain that for the comfort of the person questioning. How much better to stay with the don't know. I watch creatures live and die here. And if I address Your Majesty to a creature that is really not the same, a lizard that is not the same lizard as I saw yesterday, who's to say that it's not in some, for want of a better term, in some spirit realm, it's really the same one. I mean, my short answer is I don't know. I don't need to know, or I don't want to settle for some absolute truth. Some people say you go to heaven and live forever with the angels. Maybe that's true. I don't know. I'm open to that. Sounds a bit static to me, but who knows? Maybe that's true. Someone asked me the other day if I believed in God. A client who was very, very desperate, actually. And I kind of reverted to something that I remember Carl Jung saying, and a friend actually in South America, an indigenous teacher, said, "No, I don't believe, I know." What do you know? Some image you have of a grandfather in the sky, or some Pure Land representation of Amitabha Buddha in the sky, or no, I know something that I feel in my body every day, which has to do that we're all alive, that we're all, back to the Diamond Sutra, the distinction we make between life and death is an arbitrary mind-spun distinction. And I think the Buddhist practice of really keeping death close at hand, having it, as Carlos Castaneda reports, Don Juan told him, always keep death sitting on your left shoulder. And I remember a teacher in Sri Lanka once sent me out in the forest after I told him I was feeling very proud about my practice, asking me if I'd ever seen a dead person. And I just come back from Varanasi. I'd seen many. He said, "Well, just know you're going to look just like that sooner than you think." And I spent the day wandering in a forest filled with venomous snakes. And it's kind of stayed with me from 45 years ago, that sense, that importance of keeping the mystery of our own death. What happens when someone dies? Just keep loving them, keep the joy alive. Do things, if it's your good friend Brian, do some of the things you do with him. Think about some of the things that you talked about with him. Just keep him alive within you for as long as you can, and know that he's there. And possibly you'll find more so than when he was living. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Can I
Thank you.
follow up on John's comment?
Please.
And yours too, the idea that you dreamt about your father. And I heard somewhere once where somebody offered the idea that daytime when we're awake is only gearing us up for night in your dreams. And that's where the real reality is. And I find that I dream about my mother, but I dream about her being at different ages. Like I dreamt the other night I was dancing with her and she was like maybe 30 years old. So it was really cool to see her. So I think that can be interesting to ponder.
As you say that, I think of many indigenous practice. We think of indigenous spiritual practice. We think of ayahuasca and we think of drumming. We think of Sundance. We think of all those many very external, visible practices. But among many indigenous cultures, it's the dream work that is central. And in the same way, you can revisit your mother, as I revisited actually my mother and my father, and trust that there's I say the word healing, whatever that means, there's something being resolved there. And I would recommend for everybody to ask your unconscious to provide you dreams, to make note. There are many ways of working with dreams that we can't even touch on, but to follow that guideline. And in fact, in Asia, there was a monastery where I stayed at, a couple of places in Sri Lanka. The abbot there would work with people's dreams, not the Westerners who were staying, but with the villagers who would come, and that was part of his work, is to help them with their dreams, recognizing, even within that traditional Buddhist setting, recognizing that that's an important piece of our integration. So yeah, thank you for that. Nice.
Hi.
Hi, Rebecca.
Thank you. I loved your talk.
you.
I admire your courage to take on the transition that you obviously put thought into and had knowledge that was in essence you needed to be bring into your body. And I'd like to know more about that. But I also first want to comment about the dreaming. I have just rewritten a book I originally wrote called Lost Angels. Now it's titled Lost Angels Coming Home. And it does, central to this book is my granddaughter who died at 7 years of age, Bella. And a way for me to be close to Bella, this was maybe, I think she died 10, 11 years ago, is to have brought, for me, was to write this book and to bring a consciousness forward to my family, for my son in particular, whose daughter she is, about her being alive still, that I would encounter her in this book I write, which is fictional and also a memoir, in different spaces and in a garden, in a way that was like, oh my God, here she is. How can this be? And when I was a very young child, I often had experiences with fairies and entities and spirits and could fly. And I'm wondering, and the dream that you talk about, the dream world, is such an important part of who I am. This pandemic actually has been an opportunity in a way, because I do spend more time with my dreams. But I'd like to know more about your process in your making that decision to make that transition. I think that's so amazing, actually. I have a Quaker friend
Yeah.
who did that once 2 years ago. Tell me about it.
Okay. Well, first let's honor Bella, beautiful Bella, who lives on within you, and
Thank
you've embodied an aspect of the Diamond Sutra clearly. So changing sex, I mean, it's just one of many things you can do, and it kind of landed on me, and it's a big, it takes up a big chunk of your life because it's very preoccupying. I think the transitions I made subsequent to that were greater. In particular, my own having to question and reinvent my own relationship to the Dharma, and to break down some of the narrow constraints that I had construed for myself. And it continues. And interestingly, as it continues, my appreciation for what the Dharma offers grows. But not in, I still have mild interest in sutras and in Abhidharma, but not in the passionate way I had before. I read a statistic recently that it's something like it was under 10, maybe 9 people out of 100 in the United States had ever met a transgendered person or a genderqueer person. And I often find in the world, I meet people and I answer questions such as the one that you pose. I don't know if it took courage. I mean, life takes courage. Being alive in the 21st century takes courage. We all have incredibly difficult things to go through. And probably most of us on this call, it's small fry compared to what a lot of people are going through in these disruptive, violent times. And I include in that not just those who are standing for Black Lives Matter, but those who are opposing that out of their own terror. The people who voted for Obama and the people who voted for Trump are often the same people because they're desperate and they're just grasping at straws. So I think, we all have challenges. I was fortunate in that I had a very supportive partner. I had a very supportive Sangha and friends, and I could make that transition in all the stages that it involved, medically and otherwise. So I'm not sure that courage, sure, people say that, and sure, it was, I had to take a leap. But I think we all have to take a leap. That's the practice. That's the point of what we're doing. Your death of your 7-year-old granddaughter, that was a huge leap. And so you have courage. You didn't choose. Maybe I didn't choose. Some would say I didn't. I had the environment in which that could make itself manifest much more easily than it might have 100 years ago, or 300 years ago, I would have been burned at stake, no doubt. Who knows? So I'm not sure that answers your question. The details are, you know, from my story, I was just very lucky and very blessed, and I was tall, so people didn't beat me up. I have friends who were shorter than me, for whom it was all physically a little more dangerous. I have friends whose skin color is different from mine, who transitioned, and it definitely wasn't the same journey as mine. But for my part, I was very lucky. And in the early years, I was very much an activist. I was very much part of that broad community in Los Angeles of transgendered people for whom transition was not easy, who'd been kicked out by their families, by the society. They were unemployed, and in some instances were on the street. But that's not my story. That's how I bear witness. And I think that phrase, actually, bearing witness, is quite helpful in the context of our practice. To simply bear witness without a predetermined conclusion is very much a piece in this. That's how we continue our practice. So often as we get good at something, we begin to think that we have lots of answers. And as Suzuki famously said, you know, in the expert's mind, there are very few options. In the beginner's mind, there are many. So that's a word of advice for all ages, all times. Yeah. So thank you for your question. I'm sorry if I didn't answer it in as much detail as you might have been, as your curiosity might have been asking for.
Oh, no, thank you so much. Bless you.
Thank you.
So we had a chat posted by Corbin. Are you still here? And would you like to say something to Caitriona directly, or was it just a comment that you'd like to just leave?
I'm reading the comment. I'll read it out loud. Thank you so much. I've been wondering why Black Lives Matter has taken 7 years to go from controversial to mainstream. I'm not sure that it is mainstream. I mean, it is in a way. As you spoke about including death to go beyond death, it occurred to me that the pandemic is the first time most white people are including group vulnerability to premature death as a possibility for themselves, their loved ones. Yeah, well, I agree. I think these times, terrible as it's been for many people. We were sick, actually after a retreat at the end of March, and everybody at that retreat got sick. One friend in particular was very sick, was not hospitalized because she was beyond that and survived. Personally, I'm not sure it brought me any closer to my mortality. Even though we were sick, I knew we weren't going to die because we stay healthy. But I agree. Yeah, I think it's true that there's been a sense of camaraderie among people in the mainstream. Old students have found us from the past, and we're doing regular Zoom meditation 3 mornings a week with them. So I agree. I'm not sure if that was the question. Is Corbin still there? Yeah. Any you want to elaborate on your question? Any? No. Okay. I hope that answered it. But I agree. Anyone else? How are we doing for time? Maybe we're.
Yeah, we could take another if there's another question comes up. Just give it a moment.
Anyone?
Yes, I'd like to ask a question and just thank you so much for your talk. I just think I'm letting what you said about the Dharma percolate through me, and seeing how there's a tendency sometimes for me to use the Dharma as a tool, you know, segregating things into ways that I can understand them rather than an invitation to openness.
Yeah.
And my own vulnerability and ignorance and uncertainty. Just a little bit of one relevant fact about me. I work for climate change activism, you know, and I think there's a part of me, besides the usual human fear and needing to have something secure to cling on to, I also think there's a place of needing, a story I tell myself of needing to have some clear understanding to act from in these very tumultuous times where if you're engaged, you're invited to make decisions all the time. So I would really love to hear how you address that, because I think I'm very attracted to the openness I feel from you. And I'm also, I also see that there's another part of me that's pretty tight around how I hold the Dharma. Yeah.
Yeah. What a great question. As you were talking, I was thinking, I don't do enough. A friend posted on Facebook today, imagine that number 45 is many, many points in the lead and liable to win the November election. What would you do? Now do that. And it's that sense of the urgency. I think of a t-shirt that was common in the 80s among environmentalists, and it was a child embracing the planet, and it said, "Not with my planet, you don't." And it's that fierce instinctual energy. You know, I think it's all right to really hold on to core beliefs and ideas and values. You know, what I'm saying against what you just said, it's not there's not a contradiction there, because I think we need, and when push comes to shove, you'd certainly find me saying, no, that won't work for me. Stop that. But I think, of course, we need a Dharma of some sort, a foundation that can sustain us. And so if I leave you just with a question, just with, can I be more vulnerable? Can I be more open? Can I be more open to not knowing, and still then continue your work without so much absolute certainty framed in a certain abstract way? Then maybe that's all that, then I've done my job. We're all looking to be safe under very changeable. I mean, this is the human condition, but it's also particularly in these times when we're facing the end of history, basically. And you as environmental activists know that probably as well as anyone on this call, that we're facing death, not just our individual death, but the collapse of everything we hold dear. I mean, how's anyone supposed to put up with that when traditionally we've lived in traditionally up until the last few centuries, we've lived in something that for most people of most places could be imagined as going on forever. And we don't have that anymore. And yet as humans, we're wired for that. We're wired for community, we're wired for the village, we're wired for the land, the watershed and the land where we live, and we don't have that. So then for me to ask you to get even more vulnerable, it's presumptuous. So maybe I'm not asking you that. And I'm still navigating what it is I think I know about being vulnerable, about being open. And it's very much, as I talk about it with words, it's very much in my head. You know the answer. I'm going to give a book recommendation. And it's from a teacher of ours. I'll write it in the notes because it's not a long book. And it's by Martin Prechtel. Maybe some of you know of him. And it's called The Smell of Rain on Dust, on Grief and Praise. And I think a lot of what we're facing is our collective historical inability to wail in grief. And the story about Brian that John, you said, I mean, have you really grieved for Brian? I mean, have you gone out into the woods or by the beach and really let yourself go for a day and just weep for him And maybe that's how the ancestors continue to live in us. Sorry, smell of rain on dust. Martin is one of our teachers. We have unfortunately not been able to meet with him this year. And I bought it and then started, giving it away. I ended up buying a case of them and giving them to clients and friends. His writing is good too, and maybe you'll get drawn to his other books. But I think partly, Barry, that may tangentially help you navigate that question that you ask, in that own sense of, can I be more vulnerable? Because all of us in a way have come, one way or the other, come to the so-called new world and created havoc by our covert participation in the industrial growth society. Because our ancestors in the other countries we came from, I forgive me if I'm speaking to anyone here who's indigenous to this land. The same may apply in a different way if you are. And we fail to really grieve what's gone, what's lost. And as Martin says, our grief is really praise for what is gone, just as our praise is grief for what is yet to be lost. And that book, the last year or so, has very much informed me, all his books, but particularly that book has very much informed me in my so-called practice of living. Oh, call it practice of the Dharma, what the hell? Call it what it is. Any last thought or question?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Jishu, I'll just say, I said to you originally that I won't join the breakout groups, but I'm quite happy to, actually, to hang out. So just to hang out with a little group too. Whoever organizes the breakout groups later. Anything else?
Okay, maybe we should go to our closing chant, and from there, Corn and Dojin will organize the breakout groups, and poof, they will happen.
I just put the closing chant in the chat.
Four great bodhisattva vows. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are infinite. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is boundless. I vow to realize it.
So before we go into groups, I just want to say thank you, Caitriona. Thank you very much for this morning.
Thank you. My pleasure and honor.